This is a biography on Alexander the Great, one of the greatest conquerors who ever lived. And in it are some of the greatest tactics that I have ever heard for leadership. I mean, this entire book is just a leadership masterclass. First off though, in case you don't know that much about Alexander, he started off inheriting a small kingdom called Macedon when he was only 20 years old. For the next decade, he would conquer Persia, create his own city, Alexandria, and build an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to India. And on top of all of this, throughout his entire campaign, he never once lost a major battle. To be honest, aside from a couple skirmishes here and there, he's practically undefeated. He's like the Khabib of conquerors. But what's so interesting about Alexander is not just what he did, but it's how he was able to do what he did. He was one of the most remarkable leaders in history, and after reading this book, I completely understand why. This book is filled with principles, stories, and explanations for how Alexander was able to be the leader that he was, the leader that literally took over the world. So what I did was I broke this book down into 9 leadership principles that you can use in your work, in your organization, in your army, whatever it is, you can use it. Because his life has some of the most valuable lessons that I've ever heard. So with that said, let's just get into the first principle. Okay, we're gonna go straight into a battle where Alexander's army is about to face this other army and they're just out of range. The book says, just before they were in range of enemy arrows, Alexander halted his army and rode down the entire Macedonian line, encouraging his men. He not only cheered on his generals and officers, but the common soldiers as well. He called these by name and reminded them of their bravery in past battles. Alexander then ordered them to advance at a run as he turned his horse toward the river and led them into battle. He led them into battle. Always. This is one of Alexander's best leadership traits. It's one of his most admirable traits that he was always the one leading his men into battle. And when I say that, I don't mean that he was leading from the sidelines or from the back, but he was literally in the front lines, sometimes fighting hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. He got hurt so many times in this book doing that. Against the Persians, the book says, Roseses, who rode at the king and struck him so hard on his head with his sword that his helmet split in two. The king was stunned by the blow. A very similar thing also happens at the city of Tyre, where the Macedonian army finally gets into the city and they blow this hole in the gates. And here's what the book says. Men continued to pour into the hole, including Alexander himself was the first on top of the city walls. Alexander himself led the charge against them and killed all the defenders. First one on top of the city walls. Again, in Gaza, the exact same thing. Alexander could not help but rush to the front lines of the fight. He was almost immediately hit by an arrow fired from a catapult that pierced his shield and went straight through his armor into his shoulder. The king cursed his luck but ordered the wound be dressed and continued the fight, at least until he collapsed unconscious from loss of blood. And just to give one more example to really push this point, the book says, and this is against the Sogdians, by the way, many of the king's soldiers were injured, including Alexander himself, who suffered a shot in the right leg that broke his fibula. His physicians patched the wound as best they could. Then the king struggled back to the mountain and directed the fight until his men finally took the high ground. Throughout the book, you just constantly see Alexander fighting in the front lines, in the middle of the danger, side by side with the soldiers, and this is a super important leadership principle. If you want to be a great leader, you cannot lead from the back. You have to lead from the front. You need to constantly be putting yourself at the front lines to make sure that your soldiers know that you are right there with them, that they're not suffering alone. By doing this, the army will fight twice as hard, and you see this over and over again in history. From Joan of Arc, who would charge the city walls with the men, to Napoleon, who would position cannons himself in the midst of battle, to Sam Murray, who literally walked the plantations himself in the mid-Americas running his banana company, to even modern examples like Elon Musk, who during sprints can be seen sleeping on the factory floor, or Jensen Huang, who stays at the office until midnight many days. The point is that if your troops or your employees or your followers see that you are doing fine while they're struggling, they will never truly follow you. The people who are following you, they have to see that you are right there with them, that you are suffering with them, that you are side by side with them, and that you actually believe in the cause that they're fighting for. Being a leader means that you have to be the one to lead. At one point in Alexander's life, they're in Persia and they have to go over these mountains to conquer these mountain tribes, and it's just a super slick and wet terrain. The men are tired and they start asking Alexander to turn around and go back, and what Alexander does is just incredible. I mean, this paragraph just shows how great of a leader he was, how inspired his men were to follow him through his actions. Instead of berating his frightened men, the king jumped down from his horse and pressed ahead up the trail by himself over snow and slippery patches of ice. He took a pick and broke up the ice covering the path as he made his way forward. All his men watched and were filled with shame. First, his friends joined him in blazing the trail, then his officers, and finally the rest of his soldiers. This is what being a leader means. It means you being the one to lead the soldiers or the organization into the hardest of scenarios. That's exactly what Alexander did. Every time his soldiers or his army were about to give up, they wanted to turn around and things were getting hard, Alexander was right there at the front lines with them, continuing to push forward every single time. If he turned around and he just left, the army would have followed him, and that would have been it. But he didn't. He was always the one in front, fighting at the front lines side by side with his soldiers, and this is super important. If you want to be a great leader, you have to lead from the front lines. This is a big one. Too many people in the modern day are so shy and they're so timid. They're not really free to speak their mind, and it just creates a sort of aura of unsureness. When they try to lead, it always ends up a disaster because no one wants to follow a leader who's unsure of themselves or who even seems unsure of themselves. People are inspired by boldness, and so if you want to be a good leader, then you have to be bold in your actions. Alexander was bold ever since he was a child, and at one point in the book, there was this horse that his dad, who was the king at the time, his name was Philip, he couldn't control the horse, and so he told the horse to be taken away. Here's what the book says. Philip ordered the animal be taken away, but Alexander confronted his father and proclaimed he was losing a priceless stallion because he lacked the courage and skill to manage him. The king was not used to being chastised before his men, especially by his young son, but Alexander was beside himself with frustration and repeated his charge. Philip was angry now and glared at his son with his eye. Are you fool enough to criticize your elders? Do you really think you know horses better than we do? Alexander said, this horse at least, I can handle him better than any man alive. Oh really? And if you can't, what penalty are you willing to pay for your rashness? I will pay the whole price of the horse. Even Philip couldn't help but admire the bravado of his son and laughed along with his nobles at such youthful arrogance, but he agreed to the bargain and told his groomsmen to lead the horse to Alexander. This is one of my favorite stories in the entire book, and it's what extreme boldness looks like. But it wasn't reckless, it was calculated. What Alexander had noticed is that the horse seemed to be afraid of its own shadow, so what he did when he got the horse was he took it and he led it towards the sun so that he couldn't see the shadow. Then he slowly took the reins and began to control it. Here's what the book says. Everyone was terrified that the prince would be killed, but Alexander and Bucephalus raced far away from the crowd and back at last towards his father. A great cheer went up from all assembled, and Philip, bursting with pride, shed tears of joy and kissed his son as he dismounted. He then embraced Alexander and prophetically declared, "My son, you must seek out a kingdom equal to yourself. Macedonia is not big enough for you." This moment ended up becoming a legend for Alexander, and it made people want to follow him. It was this boldness and this confidence in his abilities to do something. Keep in mind that he inherited the kingdom when he was 20 years old. So as a 20-year-old, you have to be extremely bold and confident to have all these veterans and these older soldiers want to follow you. Without Alexander's boldness during this horse example, he would have never had that legend be made. And even though they all laughed at him at first, they then respected him, and they even looked at him like, whoa, this guy has confidence. The point here is that in order to be a good leader, you have to be bold. Your words have to have a sort of punch to them. They need to sort of shock people. I mean, just think of who you would rather follow. Person A who says, okay, we're going to go and see if we can beat Persia, and if we beat Persia, then maybe we can go after India and see what we can do from there. Or person B who says, we are going to march east and conquer anyone and anything that is in our way until we reach the ends of the earth. Maybe person A is someone who is a little bit more rational, but people do not follow rational people. They follow people with emotion, and so they're always going to choose person B. A great leader says the things that they are going to do with absolute boldness and 100% certainty, and this is the reason why people are willing to follow an even 20-year-old Alexander. If you want to be a great leader, be bold. Macedonians, said Alexander, you will be facing the Medes and Persians, nations that have long enjoyed a life of luxury, but we are hardened by the trials of our campaign and are fearless in the face of danger. Alexander made sure that his army was always doing something. They were always hardened. His army was constantly active, and that's because he knew that inactivity breeds laziness. So he made sure that they were always ready for battle. In the book, during one battle, it says, they were outnumbered, but if they fought as he knew they were able, then they would gain victory. but there must be no mistakes. Order and discipline were essential in the attack. The men must be silent when he ordered silence, shout when they needed to shout, and howl like wolves to inspire terror in the hearts of the Persians when the moment was right. Order and discipline are essential in any organization, and that's why Alexander made sure to harden his men. He did this by instituting a culture of discipline and strength. When Alexander finally conquered Babylon, this city was extremely rich, and while walking through the town, he was sort of amazed at how spoiled all these people were, how lazy it made them. And what's even crazier is that when they got there, he didn't want any part of this to infiltrate his army's mindset or weaken them in any way. Here's what the book says. Alexander ordered the encryption destroyed to show a break with the wasteful Persian ways of the past, and told his officers that those who indulged in such extravagant ways were quickly defeated in battle. The point here is that as a leader, you need to harden your soldiers. You need to constantly be on them and hurrying them and pushing them so that they don't become lazy. They must always be prepared for battle, and the leader must be the one pushing for that. When Napoleon was commanding his army, he would take his army through these brutal marches, sometimes marching them straight through the night to conquer small armies, so that by the time it came to the bigger armies, their soldiers were not just hardened, but they were also active. They were being trained to always be ready for war. Alexander was the exact same. Even when he told his soldiers to relax or give them a sort of break, they had these competitions, and the competitions were sort of to show which soldiers had the most strength, the most discipline, and so even during the breaks, they were still remaining active. By doing this, by making sure your army or your organization is staying lean and hungry and active, the other army might be feasting on their spoils, and you will always win that battle. This is another big one. Alexander must have been one of the greatest orators of all time. And by that I mean that he must have been an excellent public speaker. There are so many times in this book where the army just wants to give up, they want to go home, they're tired, and they believe they've conquered enough, and they just want to go home to their families. But Alexander was able to somehow convince his men every single time that they were not done yet, that they still had to go conquer more, and he somehow inspired his men to continue wanting to march east with him. Here's an example from the book. Alexander rose to the occasion. His years of rhetorical study under the best Greek masters and his almost supernatural ability to inspire men shone forth as he wept them over the death of their matchless general, his beloved father. He called them out to put fear aside and remember who they were, the greatest army the world had ever seen. If they would but follow him, he would lead them to riches and glory beyond their dreams. It must have been an incredible speech. These hardened veterans who longed for nothing more than home and hearth cheered their young king with all their hearts and promised to follow him wherever he might lead. Keep in mind that this was when Alexander was 20 years old and his father, the king at the time, had just been assassinated. And he somehow inspired his men to continue wanting to march forward with him. This was one of Alexander's greatest strengths as a leader, and he was constantly having to do this, to give these speeches and inspire his men to keep moving forward. Napoleon said that more battles are lost by loss of hope than loss of blood. And this is exactly right. That is why all the great leaders in history were expert speakers. They were able to speak to the hearts of their audience using both logic and emotion. At one point, Alexander even told his army, "We have marched 10,000 miles and accomplished the impossible. There is no limit to what men of noble spirit can accomplish. All of Asia lies within our grasp if we press on a little further." This is usually how his speeches would go. First, he would always fill his men with pride. He would make them feel good, tell them that they were the greatest army, the most hardened soldiers. Then he would tell them his ask, what he wants from them, to ask them to keep marching forward, to march with him a little bit longer. And then he always promised you riches and glory, and he held those riches right at their fingertips. He said they were right there, they were almost there, just one step farther, one step farther. This is the structure of a great speech, and it's how Alexander was able to convince his soldiers to keep moving every single time. If you can master the art of speaking and giving public speeches to inspire people, to speak to the hearts of people, there is nothing that your organization will not do for you. So one thing that Alexander was very wary of was becoming addicted to anything. The book says, "He showed a surprising lack of interest in the pleasures of the flesh, though he was impetuous and bold in every other way. He greatly valued self-control and had about him an air of seriousness well beyond his years." And this applied to everything. Even in his relationships, they were more so political and how they could help him gain power or make an heir, rather than a sort of emotion, desire type of way. The book continues to say, "It seems that unrestrained passion and subsequent wariness of lovemaking deeply troubled the young man. As Alexander would confess years later, sex and sleep more than anything else reminded him that he was mortal." This sort of self-discipline and self-control is something every great leader must have, because you cannot ask with discipline or self-control from your army if you yourself are not disciplined and controlled. Just to show you a little bit more about how much control he had over himself, at one point the Macedonian army is crossing this big desert and there's no water anywhere. Their soldiers are really thirsty, and one soldier manages to find a helmet of water and he gives it to Alexander. Here's what happens. Alexander refused to drink when his army could not. He took the helmet of precious water and poured it on the ground in full view of his army. To the parched men, for the king to share in their suffering in this way meant more than any water soaking into the sand. They were so hardened, says Arian, it was as if they had each drunk every drop that he poured on the ground. This is the level of discipline that you need, because at that moment, imagine you're hot, you haven't had water maybe for multiple days, and on top of that, you're the king, and there's this beautiful bowl of water right in front of you, and he still said no. This type of action is the exact type of action that inspires people to keep going. It all goes back to the principle of fighting from the front lines, of showing your soldiers that you're right there with them side by side and not fighting from the back. Because Alexander set these insanely high standards for himself and had extreme discipline and self-control, his soldiers followed in his footsteps, and this is necessary for every great leader. Conventional wisdom in the ancient world said that wars were never fought in winter. Alexander, however, was not one to follow tradition. Aside from military objectives, Alexander was seeking the glory that comes from taking an unexpected risk and winning. So one thing that made Alexander such a great leader is that he was very unconventional. And what I mean by that is that he was very different from everyone else. He really was one of a kind. And because he was one of a kind, he was able to come up with all these creative solutions to any problem that arose. For example, at a battle against the Illyrians, the Macedonian army was being chased by the cavalry of the other army, and Alexander decides to bring out catapults. And this is a very unusual decision. The book says, they had heard of catapults in siege warfare, but few before Alexander had used them against the enemy on the field of battle. This unconventional maneuver sprung from the young king's imagination at a desperate moment, bought enough time for the rest of the Macedonian army to make it across the river to safety without losing a single man. Although this is only one example, he's constantly doing this throughout his life, whether it's unconventional tactics against Darius during the second battle, or weird adaptations to warfare in the mountains against mountain tribes who no one had fought before. He's just able to come up with all these weird, crazy solutions to fight against different types of opponents. This unconventionality is sort of a commonality that you see with a lot of the great leaders, and this is for a very important reason. You can think of your organization as a sort of pyramid, with the leader being the top of the pyramid. Everything in that pyramid is sort of an extension of the top of the pyramid, and this goes for every army, any organization, any group of humans. There's always one thing at the top and a sort of extension going outwards. There's actually this great quote that says, "A business is the extension of the founder," and this can obviously go for an army as well. This means that the person at the top, the leader, has to be the one to set the standard, to set the vision, and to guide the people in a certain direction. In order to do this, you have to be a little bit unconventional, a little bit unique. You have to have a sort of essence around you, otherwise anyone can just go and take that job, right? Alexander was able to fit this unconventional mold, and because of this, he not only managed to seem unbeatable, because he was always coming up with these crazy solutions, but he was also irreplaceable, and this is why unconventionality matters. For us to appreciate the nature of Alexander and the world in which he lived, we must set aside our own preconceived notions, skepticism, and cynical disbelief to realize that the ancient world was an age of great mystery and magic. There were doubters, to be sure, but for most people, including Alexander, the gods were everywhere and controlled every aspect of life. The flight of a solitary bird in the air, the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, a troubling dream in the night, all could be signs from the gods. This following thing is something that kind of blew my mind when I heard it, but in the book it says that from his dad's side, Alexander was born into a family that traced his royal roots back to the great hero Hercules. At least that was the story the family told visitors to its court. And from his mom's side, her family claimed descent from Achilles, the greatest of the Greeks to fight at Troy. This meant that Alexander, in theory, was descendant from both Achilles and Hercules. Now, even though these are probably just myths and legends, Alexander played with them, and you have to see how this narrative shows up in the minds of the soldiers. In most of their eyes, he was a literal descendant from the most fearsome, the most hardened gods that there ever were. And even if there were some soldiers that had some sort of disbelief, imagine if you didn't believe any of these legends or myths, and then this young little kid stands up to a king and tames a horse that no one else can tame. Even at that point, you'd probably begin to be a little bit suspicious and maybe even believe in your heart a little bit. This is sort of what aligning with the mystical means. It's about mastering the art of perception, and as a leader, you have to know and you have to be able to control the perception that your people or your soldiers have about you. And if you want to be a great leader, then you have to align with the mystical. Although people don't believe in these Greek gods or any of these myths and legends anymore, so you can't really portray yourself as one of them, there is still a way that you can do this. Because even though we have all this technology and this rationality now, our minds are still the same minds that the soldiers back then 2,000 years ago had. The same soldiers who believed that this one guy was a descendant from the gods. You see, whatever people don't understand, they believe to be a sort of magic. If you have success after success after success, and you sort of play it off like it's no big deal, like you barely put any work into it at all, to other people, it sort of seems like magic. They just can't understand it. If you succeed enough times and you play it off like it's nothing, eventually your people, if it's not in the front of their minds, in the back of their minds, they're going to think like you're sort of destined to win, you're destined to lead, you're destined to do what you're doing. Now to you, all of this winning might be preparation and hard work, but to the people following you, it's more than that. You're sort of becoming, in their minds, a mythical figure. Not a descendant of Hercules or Achilles, but you have this aura around you, an aura of being more than human almost. And being able to build this perception around you is something that a lot of great leaders have done. Another way to do this, though, leads to the next point. Having unshakable belief. This can make or break you as a leader. When you have a vision so clear and you have this sort of unshakable belief that that vision will come true, people are attracted to that and they'll be bound to follow you. Alexander always believed in himself, but it wasn't until an oracle told him that he was destined to do something where he really built this unshakable, unmoving belief that he was meant to conquer the world. The book says, he instead posed a final query asking if he was destined to be a master of all the world. To this, the oracle gave a simple but profound nod of assent. It was, as the historian Arian says, the answer his heart most desired. Now at last Alexander knew who he was and what destiny stretched before him. He was still man who could bleed and die like any other, but from that day forward, Alexander knew a spark of the divine burned inside him. Oh, that last line literally... That last line is super important because it is what ties you to the mystical. And believe it or not, it's something that actually repeats over and over again with many of the great leaders in history. Winston Churchill, when he was riding around a pony on the front lines in India, talks about how he was protected by Providence, with bullets flying around him. George Washington, also many times during the American Revolution, talks about leaving the battle in the hands of fate or Providence. Napoleon was constantly talking about fortune. Even in Egypt, when everyone thought that destiny had abandoned him, he said, "She has not abandoned us yet." And when he lost at Waterloo, the reason he gave was, "I felt that fortune was abandoning me. I no longer had the feeling that I was sure to succeed." The point is that having this outward appearance of unshakable belief inspires the people around you. Before Alexander's second battle against King Darius, his commanders were very nervous, but Alexander was very calm. He even slept in that day, and the book says, the indignant old general asked how he could be sleeping so soundly as if he had gained a victory when the battle was still ahead. Alexander only smiled and said, "Why don't you know? We already won." Why don't you know we already won? What a great line that is. That's not told enough. If you truly believe that you have a sort of spark of the divine inside of you that you can't lose, that you're destined to win, it's almost something that makes it happen so. It allows you to never be discouraged and to have an unshakable belief. And I know this sounds a little bit cringe, but it really does give off that aura around you. People can feel that. The people around you can see that. And even subconsciously, they start thinking, maybe this person is just destined to win. And so I just wanted to mention this because it really is a commonality that you see in these great leaders of history, that they have unshakable belief. They just believe that they have a spark of the divine in them, that they are destined to change the world. I think this one might be something that maybe you can't develop. It might just be something that you either have or you don't, and that is genuine courage. But Alexander had an unbelievable amount of courage, and it made him great. I mean, if I were to recommend this book for any reason, it would be this one, because Alexander just had an insane amount of courage and bravery, and he put himself in dangerous situations when he didn't have to, all for the point of inspiring men. At one point, he receives a tip from his literal enemy, Parmenion, that his friend Philip is attempting to poison him through a medicine. Alexander trusted Philip though, and what happens next is really amazing. What happened next provides a marvelous insight into Alexander's character. He took the cup and began to drink the medicine while at the same moment handing Philip the note from Parmenion. again. As he drained the cup to the last drop, he watched the physician read the message. It turns out he was right and his friend wasn't trying to poison him. It was just his enemy trying to trick him into getting sicker. But this just takes an insane amount of courage to know that you might be poisoned, but trusting your friend anyway and showing that not with the words, but with actions. He could have had his friend arrested, interrogated him, not drink the medicine, but instead he chose to just show him with action that he trusted him. And it's actions like these, the little actions where you just take the hard route just to take the hard route, that show why Alexander is Alexander the Great. This exact type of courage is shown again and again in battle. In one battle, his men were trying to get into the citadel, and they had this ladder that they were attempting to climb, but every time they would climb it and someone got into the citadel, they would just get mowed down. Alexander was getting extremely frustrated, so what he did was he climbed the ladder himself and made it in, but then he realized he was trapped inside while his men were still scrambling to get into the citadel. So he gets trapped in there and he starts fighting his enemy alone while his men try to figure out how they can get in and help him, and he eventually gets shot with an arrow that goes straight through his armor. As the soldiers finally get into the citadel and they start dragging him away from battle, everyone thinks he's dead. There's an arrow through his chest, he's losing a lot of blood very fast, but at the very last moment, before he goes into a tent, he's still in view of his army by the way, he gets on a horse to show everyone that he's alright, and his soldiers were extremely inspired by this. What happens next might be my favorite paragraph in the book because it really does speak to the heart of Alexander, to the heart of everything that he was about. Once he had regained some of his strength, his offers began to chide him that his performance on the wall was a brave but foolish act for a king. It was not the job of a commander, they said, to risk his life in such a way when there were plenty of men in the army who could do the same thing. Alexander did not know how to tell his friends that for him, such actions were an essential part of being a king. Faced with such criticism, he walked out of his tent into camp. A grizzled veteran from Boeotia in central Greece who had heard about the rebukes of Alexander's companions approached him. The man looked Alexander straight in the eye and said just a few words in his rural dialect. "Alexander, brave deeds are what true men do." The king embraced the old soldier and considered him a friend for the rest of his life. A lot of Alexander comes down to this: strength for the sake of strength, courage for the sake of courage, doing the hard thing for the sake of doing the hard thing. At the end of the day, Alexander was a great leader simply because he was extreme about a few set of principles, and he inspired other men to be extreme about those same principles. And he was able to lead his men and inspire his men and do everything that he did throughout his entire life because he showed genuine courage when it mattered. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, you might like this video, which is actually very similar to this one, except about Napoleon and the tactics that he used to conquer the world. If you want to work with me on your leadership skills so that you too can lead like the greats of history, I do offer coaching. You can check out my website, nickmunoz.com, or you can check out the link in the description. That's it. See ya.